Beginning with breaking news in President-elect Donald Trump's New York hush money case. Just moments ago, Judge Juan Merchan announced he will delay making a decision on Trump's motion to set aside his guilty verdict and dismiss the case. Merchan was set to announce that decision today. Now he says he won't announce it until next week. Trump's team is arguing to throw out the guilty verdict, citing the Supreme Court ruling earlier this year that gave presidents immunity from prosecution for official acts. Let's bring in MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin and former federal prosecutor Barrett Berger. And so, Lisa, this just happened. What more are we learning about Judge Merchan's decision to postpone this?
So this is not a decision that Judge Merchan reached on his own. This is rather the parties came to him together and said that Trump's team had asked the district attorney's office whether they would agree to a stay, given constitutional concerns about sentencing a future president and a president-elect, particularly in light of the burdens of an upcoming presidential transition. And that's when the district attorney's office said, yeah, we agree. There are some competing interests here that have to be balanced. On one hand, we want to support the jury verdict. We believe that it was reached correctly. On the other hand, there are some legitimate concerns here dealing with the office of the president. And so we are asking you jointly to stay all deadlines in this case. We will come back to you. And it sounds like he has now said, I am going to stay these deadlines until November 19th. And you have to come back to me by 10 a.m. on November 19th, telling me your view, this is a quote from the order this morning, your view of the appropriate steps going forward. So today, as of today, we are not going to get a decision on whether or not the verdict should stand. And we are not going ahead toward that November 26th sentencing right now. The next deadline in this case is November 19th, when each side has to tell Judge Merchan how they believe we should move forward.
Barrett, are you surprised at all by this delay, especially that the prosecutors are also asking for this delay, given all along that had been a tactic of the Trump team to delay?
I'm not surprised because the landscape really has changed here, right? I mean, the judge has to look at this decision now through two lenses. The legal lens, which he's been prepared to do probably for the last 2 months as he's been writing his opinion. Both sides have briefed this. But now we have this political lens that he has to look through, too, because things have changed pretty drastically after the election. So now, because of the OLC opinion, because of the Supreme Court's opinion, we're in a very different political space where Trump, because he is going to be president, can't be prosecuted. Similarly, there are probably certain sentencing remedies that if Judge Merchan was to decide that these charges should stand and he should go forward with sentencing, certain sentencing options are probably off the table. So my guess is Judge Merchan wants the parties to weigh in and help him as he's reaching this really critical decision.
And even before this latest development, you had said there are a number of different pathways that Judge Merchan could go with this decision in general, right? It's not just dismiss the case or sentence Trump to whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the Supreme Court's decision from the summer gave the president-elect very broad immunity for official acts that he committed as president. But what it didn't do was offer a lot of detail about how to define what an official act is. So this is what sort of the meat that Judge Merchan is really getting into here. But even if he finds that these acts were official acts, that doesn't necessarily mean it leads to dismissal of the case. He may then find, yes, a few of these were official acts because they happened while President Trump was in office. However, they're really ancillary to the ultimate issue in the case. They didn't infect the whole trial, and we can sort of put those aside and still sustain the jury's verdict.
Lisa, I mean, do you see any possibility of the judge actually sentencing Trump 3 weeks here after he, won an election?
I think particularly in light of developments this morning, Anna, where I see this going is perhaps toward a solution where the conviction stands, but there is no sentencing, and both parties agree that either Trump should be sentenced to time served or solely to probation, and that no sentencing hearing is necessary or appropriate. The thing that President Trump's team most wants to avoid is to remind the American public that he was convicted of these 34 felony counts by forcing him to enter the courtroom and sit there as Judge Merchan sentences him. They do not want those optics. They do not want the burden of forcing him to come to New York and go through that. And that's a security risk, I think, for everyone concerned as well. They don't want the inflammation of that proceeding. So Where I think we could land is a place where the conviction stands, but there is no sentence here imposed on former President Trump.
And Lisa, real quick, we also had another ruling just come down before the show related to a separate case, this one involving Mark Meadows in the Georgia election interference case. Fill us in.
So Mark Meadows has been arguing for a long time that as a former federal officer, he is entitled to move that Georgia election interference case to a federal court. He lost that argument in a federal district court and in federal appeals court. He then went to the United States Supreme Court for a last-ditch effort to try and move that case from Fulton County Superior Court to a federal court. The Supreme Court this morning saying, no, Mark Meadows, we're not going to step in. So if Mark Meadows thinks that the case against him shouldn't go forward, his best hope right now is to look to former President Trump and future President Trump and ask for that pardon.
Of course, the Georgia case is a state case. It's not a federal case. So if Trump takes office and that's still ongoing.
I'm mistaken. And he can't be pardoned for that. So, you know, as I'm
Trump could pardon Mark Meadows,
no,
right?
He couldn't. He couldn't pardon him for a state crime. So I am mistaken in saying that he could ask him for a pardon. As I'm hearing myself talk, there is no pardon that could be granted. Really, the only solution here for Mark Meadows is to win that case on the merits or hope that it gets thrown out, because on appeal, the Georgia Court of Appeals could find that Fani Willis should not stay in control of the case. That's the issue that was already resolved before Judge Scott McAfee of the Fulton County Superior Court earlier this year. Meadows, Trump, and others have now escalated that to an appeals court to say, you know what, Fani Willis, you are too interested. You have too much going on here in terms of your stake with Nathan Wade and the finances to remain in control of your case. If she gets stripped of her control of the case, and it's largely thought that the case would not continue. That's Mark Meadows'
Do you
best
see the Georgia case continuing if Trump takes office? Again, he can't touch this case. He doesn't have control over, I mean, this is not a DOJ case. He wouldn't have control over the state prosecutors, right? So do you think it moves forward?
Well, it leaves us in this really odd position where the president can't be prosecuted because of his role as the president and this broad immunity that he has. However, other defendants, co-defendants, people that maybe played a lesser role still can be prosecuted. So it leaves us in a bizarre situation where sometimes the person that perhaps was the most culpable is not going to be prosecuted, while others with lesser culpability might. I think that the president may be able to exert some political pressure, even though he can't pardon him. He may be able to pressure state leaders to do some sort of a clemency or some sort of state level.
And of course, we know in the state of Georgia, it is Republicans who are at the top.
The first person Donald Trump ever appointed to be his national security advisor was this guy, General Mike Flynn. Flynn lasted in that position for all of 24 days before he was indicted for lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russian officials and had to resign. Trump then cycled through several other national security advisors. There was H.R. McMaster, who went on to call Trump's presidency an exercise in competitive sycophancy. There was John Bolton, who went on to call Trump unfit to serve as president. Trump's final first-term national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, might have stayed in the fold had he not committed the cardinal sin of admitting that Biden won the 2020 election and promising a smooth transition of power in the weeks after Trump lost. And now Donald Trump has found the guy he wants to be his next national security advisor, Republican Congressman Michael Waltz, who is more than ready to compete in the sycophant Olympics. Waltz co-sponsored a bill to rename Dulles International Airport after Donald Trump. He showed up outside Trump's criminal trial to defend the president's hush money arrangement with an adult film star. And Waltz worked with other election-denying Republicans to try and overturn the results of the 2020 election, leading his hometown paper to retract its endorsement of him. We had no idea, had no way of knowing at the time, that Waltz was not committed to democracy. So that's the man Donald Trump has picked to be his national security advisor, and he finds himself in rare company. Tonight, Trump announced that Fox News host Pete Hegseth is his choice to be the next Secretary of Defense. Prior to joining Fox News, Hegseth was an Army officer who served at Guantanamo. During the first Trump administration, Hegseth privately lobbied Trump to pardon 2 U.S. service members accused of war crimes, which Trump then did. He also has some questionable views on personal hygiene.
I don't think I've washed my hands for 10 years. Really, I don't really wash my hands ever.
Help me!
No, I inoculate myself. It's just not, germs are not a real thing. I can't see them, therefore they're not real.
Gross. Today, Trump also tapped two of his favorite cheerleaders, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, to head his new Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which is an internet pun I'm not going to bother explaining. Trump claims the new department will dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, and cut wasteful expenditures, all in the name of making government more efficient, because nothing says government efficiency like tapping two people to do one person's job. There's also Trump's nominee for ambassador to Israel, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. When Huckabee ran for president in 2008, he reportedly told voters at one campaign event, "I have to be careful saying this because people get really upset. There's really no such thing as a Palestinian. That's been a political tool to try to force land away from Israel." All of this is part of Huckabee's worldview as an evangelical Christian Zionist. As Sarah Posner writes at MSNBC.com, for many Christian Zionists, and particularly for popular evangelists with significant clout within the Republican Party, their support for Israel is rooted in its role in the supposed end times. Jesus' return to earth, a bloody final battle at Armageddon, and Jesus ruling the world from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In other words, for people like Mike Huckabee, supporting Israel is less about Jewish self-determination and more about using the Jewish people as a means to an end times prophecy, one where all non-Christians face eternal punishment. That is who Donald Trump has chosen for his cabinet so far, and it has only been a week. Donald Trump has been on a tear over the past 72 hours, appointing loyalists, many of whom are entirely unqualified to key positions in his future cabinet. Marco Rubio is expected to be named Secretary of State. Elise Stefanik will be UN ambassador, and Fox News host Pete Hegseth will serve as Defense Secretary. Because he is Donald Trump, he has also been clear about who he is not choosing for key roles, posting on social media that Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo will not be invited to join his second administration. Joining me now is George Conway. He is a contributor for The Atlantic and a wealth of information and feelings about Donald Trump. First of all,
yeah,
I mean, as we all are to a certain degree, we have some reporting that the vetting process or the sort of the deliberation process involves a lot of television. Here's what the war room at Mar-a-Lago, where these decisions are being made, contains multiple large television screens, which can be used to show multimedia about individual candidates or screen clips of their cable news appearances as needed. It's how you look on TV that gets you the job.
It's how you look on TV, but also how you suck up to the boss and tell the boss he's great and tell the boss how much he's persecuted and how wonderful he is. And that's the main purpose of the people surrounding Donald Trump. It's not to actually run anything, God forbid. It's to basically assuage his ego. And that's what this sequel, where, you know, the writers seem to have jumped the shark before we even got to the opening credits.
Pete Hegseth, George.
Yes.
A Fox News host. Yeah. A man with
Makes
a
you
very
want to wash your hands. I mean,
questionable history at Gitmo, a person who successfully got Trump to pardon war criminals. Right. I mean, this person's going to be the defense secretary. There is clearly no thought about how, potentially.
He wasn't even a weekday host on Fox and Friends.
He was a weekend host. But I mean, first of all, how long? I mean, the churn here, I would think, would be remarkable.
The churn is going to be remarkable. The churn always is remarkable. But there may be less churn for the following reason: is these people are not going to challenge him in any way.
Yeah.
Okay. There was churn in the first Trump administration because people would occasionally stand up to him or slow things down or take paper off his desk or say no to him. You know, like his White House counsel, Don McGahn, basically refused to commit a crime for him. And, you know, there are all sorts of instances where people were kind of resisting his stupidest urges because he's not very bright, doesn't know anything about how the government works. And they all treated him in the first administration. They understood that he didn't know anything. And they kind of treated him that way, and he got mad about it. And sooner or later, he'd fire the people and then claim that they were terrible. And then who hired those people, by the way? And then later we didn't see very many of them supporting him in 2024. But somehow he's back, and the people who are coming in this time are they're being vetted the way he wants to vet them, was by watching TV to see what they say about him. Makes perfect sense. It's perfect for a narcissist.
Now, Marco Rubio has certainly of late been in the camp of knee benders to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But he does have a past, a very distant past, of being a critic. And I wonder if you hold out any hope that he is in some way tethered to reality as the Secretary of State. Well,
look, I don't have the full opposition research file on Marco Rubio. I try not to pay too much attention to him. But, he's been all over the place on all sorts of things. I mean, he was very, pro-anti-Russia at one point. Now he's like, let's sell out the Ukrainians. It's whatever. He will do whatever Trump wants. And now, at least when you're in the Senate, it's kind of a cushy and secure job, relatively speaking. You don't have to run except every 6 years, and people say, "Oh, I'm a senator," and they follow you around and they're respectful to you. It's like, that's not going to be true anymore. He's an employee at will. He'll be an employee at will now.
Yeah,
and that's not, for a guy who, I don't know where he goes from here if he loses that job.
Well, perhaps it's his way of appeasing the MAGA right as he, sharpens his tools for another potential, presidential run in 2028. Who knows anything about anything that's happening
None of it,
there, right?
Right, exactly.
Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk being offered jobs in a fantasy football league.
Non-existent department, right.
The Department of Government Efficiency. Nothing has been more Orwellian in title. It doesn't actually exist.
Right.
Can they just can they bring it into an existence by the sheer force of their own will? I mean, what do you think is the plan here?
First of all, it's not going to be a governmental department, as I understand it. And then, there are actually rules and statutes that apply. I think the Federal Advisory Committee Act talks about regulates from an ethics standpoint people who are coming in and being consulted on how to run the government. And I'm not an expert in that, but we're going to end up knowing a lot more about it in the not too distant future, I think.
George, we're going to become experts in confirmation processes during Senate recesses. We're going to understand appropriations like never before, parliamentary procedure. It's going to be a whole big education for the American public. Good luck to us all, George Conway. Thank you for your time and your credible disbelief at everything that's happening right now.
Why did the Democrats lose last week?
I think there are a number of reasons, but there was a pivotal moment in the campaign. That was on The View, when the vice president was asked, what would you have done different in the last 4 years than President Biden did? Now, we were in a country that 65% thought had gone off on the wrong track. And that's the money question. And she said, I can't think of anything. And, of course, the Trump people had it up as an ad 6 hours later. And when you're in a country that wants something different, you got to give them something different. And we had a whole bevy of candidates that were very articulate, very able to distill and put a message out, but we were never allowed to choose that. And we were just where we were. And that was not a good answer. And people will come back and say, well, she did a lot of things right. Yeah, if you do 49 things right, but you do the big thing wrong, it haunts you in politics. It's a business where some things stick harder than other things.
Yeah. Well, and that's a point that's very much a right now point, James. What you said about Biden, those numbers, her being partly arguing for change, but being tied to Biden. There's a larger thing that happens, as you know, after every election, which is everybody says the party should do what they were saying anyway, meaning the liberals want it more left, the centrists want it more center, yada, yada. I want to play Bernie Sanders, who on the one hand has been consistent about what he thinks, but on the other hand, maybe that means it's just the same answer every time. But here's what Sanders said now.
If you're an average working person out there, do you really think that the Democratic Party is going to the mats, taking on powerful special interests and fighting for you? I think the overwhelming answer is no. And that is what has got to change. When you have millions and millions of people working for starvation wages, you got to speak to that reality.
Was that the problem? It wasn't done enough. And you are, James, if nothing else, I never like to talk about, and if I didn't know you better, I wouldn't talk about what could go on your tombstone, hopefully many decades from now. But it might be it's the economy stupid, among other things. So you, as Mr. It's the economy stupid, was this an economy election? And if so, is Sanders right that on populist, working class, kitchen table issues, the Dems didn't do enough?
Well, what he is not right about, the Democrats have done a number of things for working people. I mean, Obamacare expanded health care for 23 million more people than had it before. A lot of things in President Biden's Build Back Better program created millions of jobs for working people. But I think Senator Sanders has some of a point here, and that is there were things we could have run on harder that have effect. The minimum wage. It passes everywhere by 70%. I mean, I know that President Biden was for it and Harris was for it, but we didn't put it front and center. What about taxing the incomes over $400,000 and taking that money and put it in a first-time home buyer's mortgage relief fund? I mean, there were things that Senator Sanders would favor that we could have put more front and center. Now, you know, there are a lot of things that are just popular that Democrats are for, and they're popular with every kind of Democrat in the country. They also happen to be popular with independents and even some Republicans. And we should run on a popular thing. A popular thing was not continuing the Biden administration. That was clearly not what people wanted. I think he's a great guy, but people didn't want more of that, and that's what we gave him.
I mean, yeah, I'm letting that sink in. You know, it's funny. I'm just going to talk to you really directly. It's like the biggest thing ever happened. You got rid of a sitting incumbent president after he'd won the primary. This never happened before. And the reason was that everybody from Pelosi on down had absorbed the fact that he was going to lose big, so you had to do something big. And then you land on, as you just argued, his literal replacement and a message that was still very much tied to Bidenism. So was that almost all baked in? I mean, how would you have changed that? Only had there been a different candidate?
Yeah, okay, so he gets out on July 21st. Harris has to keep the campaign headquarters in Wilmington. She keeps Biden's campaign manager. She keeps the entire staff. All right. That's a hard thing to do because they're not going to. Jen Dillon, no matter, Mally Dillon's not going to attack Biden. Biden is. I wouldn't no more now would attack Clinton. But each thing is different, and we didn't have a choice. So, like I said, we didn't get to kick the tires. We didn't get to look under the hood. We didn't get to look at the trim. We were just given the keys at full sticker price, and honestly, we had no choice. But by July 21st, we probably didn't have much of a choice. And Ari, the thing that I will believe to pass my dying day is this. The talent level in the Democratic Party is utterly breathtaking. I would have given anything if we could have gotten 5 or 6 of these people out on the track, let them run around, let people look at them, and just see, because when they look at us, they think we're an urban old party that's attached to some exotic positions, which is not the case of many Democrats out there in the country that are very skilled and would have made a great primary and a lot of fun, and I think would have done the party brand a lot of good.
So let me put it like this. Where does that responsibility lie on the timing and how late Biden got out? Because if you're going to get out earlier. Does that lie with, well, let me ask the question, James. Does that lie with the brain trust around him or with Joe Biden himself?
With President Biden himself. Presidents are responsible for everything. They have aides, they have people, they have friends, they have everything else. But if he would have gotten out in the fall of last year, we'd have had 8 people running for president of every kind of thing you could imagine all over the country, and I mean some really skilled people. But when you wait till the end, ultimately he's in charge. I don't blame the staff. I don't blame anybody else. He's the one that made the decision to stay. He stayed in over 3 weeks after the debate. I mean, even if he would have gotten out the day after the debate, we might have been able to organize some town halls and get this talent out there. That's what kills me. Is I know how good some of these people are, and they're sitting there playing They got 350 hitters all over AAA ball. Well, they're not any good unless you bring them up.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, and I want to start tonight by looking at something that happened the last time a Republican candidate for president won the popular vote. It was 20 years ago.
We must work to move America forward. I want to be your president for 4 more years to make our country safer.
It is noon on the East Coast and 9 a.m. out west, and NBC News now projects George W. Bush wins the 2004 presidential election. And so now George W. Bush, by a margin of more than 3 million votes, will serve 4 more years as president of the United States.
It was widely seen as a decisive victory by the pundits, a race that Bush won by just under 3 million votes out of 111 million cast, taking the popular vote by, as you see, just over 2%. Now, that's pretty close. Like, it's pretty close to 50-50, a point that one new senator-elect from Illinois made on election night before the race was even called.
I think that, what's important as we move forward, regardless of what happens at the presidential level, and I'd give the same advice to John Kerry or President Bush, I think it's really important at this stage to recognize that this is a 51-49 country or a 50-50 country, and that whoever's in power has to show a certain humility and a recognition that they've only convinced half the people. For us to move together, we need a much higher percentage of folks moving in the same direction.
A 50-50 country. Humility. So said Senator-elect Barack Obama on election night on Fox News, in fact. Now, the race wasn't even called until the morning after the election, as you saw there, because of a close vote in the central swing state of Ohio. If it had gone the other way, Bush would have actually lost that election despite winning the popular vote. It was even crazier because Democrats had a massive voter turnout operation that had hit its numbers in Ohio and elsewhere.
The Democrats thought they were going to mobilize their vote and get this huge new vote out and swamp the Republicans. But in the end, it was the Republicans that mobilized a huge vote. And it really was a vote a kind of vote that I haven't seen in Ohio before in terms of the numbers of Republicans and the margins they were producing, in especially some of the rural counties.
Sound familiar? So how did Bush win? And how did he run up such big numbers in those rural areas? Remember, this was only 3 years after 9/11. Americans were still kind of rallying around the flag and the wartime leader. Bush had claimed the mantle of wartime president, launched the war in Iraq, declared famously mission accomplished in that indelible image, even as it was already, when voters went to the polls, becoming clear the invasion of Iraq was becoming a disaster. Now, immediately after that loss, Democrats began, you'll never guess what, soul searching, finger pointing, anxiously wondering how had they grown out of touch with middle America. Lots of folks pored over a just-released book by the great writer and social critic Thomas Frank, which became a huge bestseller, called What's the Matter with Kansas? And in it, he detailed how Republicans and conservatives used these sort of culture war fights and wild accusations against liberals as a bait and switch to win over working class and rural voters and get them to vote against their economic interests.
This great movement to the right that we've had over the last 36-odd years is so familiar, I think, that probably everybody in this room has a conversion story that they can tell. How their dad had been a union steel worker, say, and a stalwart Democrat, but how one day all their brothers and sisters started voting Republican. Or how their cousin gave up on Methodism and started going to the Pentecostal church out on the edge of town. Or how they themselves just got so sick and tired of being scolded for eating meat or for wearing clothes emblazoned with Chief Elina Weck, that one day Fox News started to seem fair and balanced to them after all.
Some real echoes here, right? 20 years later. And again, against this backdrop, Republicans were triumphant, and they painted Democrats as these terrorism appeasers, as weak-kneed, as out-of-touch, bleeding-heart liberals clustered in urban enclaves and campus anti-war protests. And they interpreted Bush's reelection as a broad mandate for all of their craziest policy ideas. In his first press conference after the election, the president himself said as much.
When you win, there is a feeling that the people have spoken and embraced your point of view, and that's what I intend to tell the Congress. You asked, do I feel free? Let me put it to you this way. I earned capital in the campaign, political capital, and now I intend to spend it.
The second-term agenda meant an expansion of the global war on terror overseas and at home. It was a bonanza of privatization of government functions. The centerpiece of this agenda, the first big way he was going to spend that capital, was a policy championed by the Conservative Heritage Foundation. Might sound familiar. It was a plan to privatize basically all or at least part of Social Security, to make that federally guaranteed benefit, right? That rock solid benefit. You pay your whole life, you get the money back. More like a workplace retirement account, more like a gamble in the market. Now, this had been a long-standing Republican dream. Bush claimed the Social Security program was in crisis and would be insolvent in just over a decade. Voters were not interested in hearing that. In fact, the harder that Bush and Republicans pushed, the less popular Social Security reform became in polls. And so Democrats on Capitol Hill did something rare. They dug their heels in and they fought Republicans tooth and nail. In fact, one aide to then House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi recalls that nervous colleagues would ask her when the party's alternative Social Security reform plan would be released, and Pelosi responded, never. Does never work for you? So, Bush has just been reelected, Republican House and a Republican Senate, government trifecta. And even with that, and even with the political capital he gained in his reelection, even with all the takes afterwards about how America just hates the libs and Republicans and conservatives are send it, George W. Bush could never even get his plan for privatizing Social Security to a vote on Capitol Hill. Didn't even get a vote because it was so radioactive. It was an unpopular idea that no one had asked for and no one had really voted for, right? That 51% of the country voted for George W. Bush. They weren't like, please privatize our Social Security. I mean, outside of the Heritage Foundation, of course. And that fight even contributed to Democrats taking back the House and the Senate in 2006. And I think you can see where I'm going here. The reason I'm talking about all this tonight is that there's something brewing similar here with Donald Trump, something similar that recalls what happened. The president-elect laid out something in a video yesterday regarding his plans, which are embodied in Project 2025, on how he will essentially overhaul the education system. And that plan, of course, is to abolish the Department of Education. It is a goal, very much like privatizing Social Security, that has been a fever dream of Republicans for decades. This is not new. It, of course, requires congressional approval. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has a plan for liquidating the department and assigning its functions to other departments. It's all drawn out in that Project 2025 blueprint. And it is not popular, okay? Just one bit of polling data, UMass Amherst poll, late last month found 6 in 10 respondents oppose eliminating the Department of Education, firing civil servants, replacing them with political appointees loyal to the president. Now, all of this looks like it's going to be happening. I mean, we're starting to see the signs of it, despite the fact the Department of Education oversees all of the $1.6 trillion in federal student loans Americans have borrowed. It enforces civil rights in education. It collects vital statistics on enrollments, staffing, crime that schools nationwide rely on, and it administers billions in federal grants to support America's poorest students, as well as, and here's something I think you're going to hear a lot about, students with special needs. Now, if you have a student in your family that relies on special education or has a IEP, an individualized education program, that's thanks to the Department of Education. They are the funding source, hear me now, for every IEP in the country. Every single one comes through that department. And I would like to know how many millions of voters are in families that rely on those IEPs. The reason Republicans have dreamed of abolishing the Department of Education but never actually done it is because it will disrupt the lives of millions of families and kids in ways they will remember forever. So I find the lesson of George W. Bush and Social Security reform illuminating here. Then as now, we have a Republican president-elect winning a thin majority of votes. And then as now, they want to act as if they have a sweeping mandate to remake a federal institution that millions of Americans rely on. Like all of a sudden, a majority decided the Heritage Foundation was the way to go. There's going to be a fight on that. And that is a fight that Democrats, I think, would love to have.
What is taking so long? The consequential battle for 218 seats, control of House of Representatives, now stands at 215 for Republicans, 206 for Democrats, with the majority of undecided seats in California. The last update from the state showed more than 2.5 million unprocessed ballots. But Republicans aren't waiting. They're moving ahead with leadership elections tomorrow. Anyone who wanted to run for a position had to put their name in by noon today. So that leaves Congress with kind of dueling dramas. If Republicans win the House, will they fall in line and not have the resistance of the last session? And, of course, who will become the leader of the Senate? NBC's Julie Sirkin is on Capitol Hill. Brendan Buck was an aide to former Republican speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan and is an MSNBC political analyst. Julie, why is it taking so long? I get this question, and I'm sure you do all the time. And what are both sides planning for in terms of those leadership elections?
Yeah, Chris, well, you mentioned California. That is a state where the most of these uncalled races exist. It's a deep blue state, but these districts are swingy. They're purple districts that could actually give Republicans more control over the House. I say that because they need to flip, or to get, I should say, just 3 more seats to reach that 218 threshold. In California, though, the county elections offices are actually allowed to accept up to 7 days after Election Day any ballot that was postmarked, mail ballot postmarked for Election Day, but they could still count those days after, maybe even up to a week after. Some sources I spoke to said they don't expect to know control of the House in earnest until next week. The final counts could not be completed, Chris, until Thanksgiving. Nonetheless, though, you mentioned that both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are pushing ahead with their leadership elections. Republicans are actually meeting tomorrow to get that process going. What you should know is that the top 3 leadership positions for House Republicans, I'm talking about Speaker, or in a case that Republicans lose, a small case, the Republican leader would go to Mike Johnson. It would also keep in place Steve Scalise, who is the current number 2 Republican in the House, and Tom Emmer, who's the vote counter for Republicans. Everybody below them, including the person to replace Elise Stefanik, who was named to the Trump administration, had until 12 today to put their name in. Tomorrow, they'll get behind closed doors in a secret ballot process and try and fill out the rest of the leadership structure. When it comes to Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries and House Democratic leadership are perhaps the only Democrats that are not facing fury right now, and that is because, as Speaker Emerita Pelosi pointed out, House Democrats actually ran well ahead of the top of the ticket, beating, of course, Harris's performance. You see that in that some of these close races are still being counted. So that process will get going tomorrow. But even though we heard a warning from Johnson and from Scalise not to dwindle their majority even further, with Trump taking more potentially of those picks for his cabinet. Chris.
So, Brendan, if Republicans do become the majority, even with Trump's resounding win, the Wall Street Journal notes this, quote, some members who are returning to Washington this week indicated they wouldn't be bossed around in the next term. Indiana's Republican Congresswoman Victoria Spartz said she isn't worried about repercussions from Trump if she decides to break from Republican leaders' orders on long-term government spending or health care policy. So do you think she's in the majority, or is she the exception to the rule?
She's probably the exception. What I will say is that we have to put the buckets of, there's 2 buckets of what Republicans are going to be doing next year. The things they want to do, like the tax bill and maybe some energy policy, where they may be able to do these things using a procedure where they don't need Democrats. They can pass everything on their own. And those things that they want to do, even with a really small majority, I think they're probably going to be able to be successful. But then there are the things that they have to do. And that's where Republicans have stubbed their foot time and time again. That's like funding the government, increasing the debt limit. And while Hakeem Jeffries has been the minority leader this past Congress, he has had plenty of action. And I expect that to continue. I don't think there's any way that, even with all of this unified Republican Congress, even with Donald Trump there to try to keep people in line, I don't see any scenario in which all Republicans are willing to increase the debt limit on their own, for example. They're going to need Democratic votes to increase the debt limit. They're probably going to need Democratic votes to fund the government. And that's where Hakeem Jeffries is going to actually have a lot of leverage and a lot of power in this Congress. A lot of fanfare about work on tax reform and other things they want to do, but keep an eye on those things that are actually really, really important. Avoiding a government shutdown, avoiding a debt default.
Meantime, Brendan, let's talk about the Senate side, shall we? You have leadership elections scheduled for tomorrow. Senators Thune, Cornyn, Scott. I think the way they do it right is they have a secret ballot and then they narrow it down and then you have one-on-one. Tell me what you're watching for and what you think the outcome might be.
Well, I still think that Senator John Thune is probably the favorite. This sort of breaks down the two Johns versus John Thune and John Cornyn versus Rick Scott. Rick Scott is clearly playing himself out to be the MAGA candidate. He's gone all in with Trump, even to the point where he was hanging out with Laura Loomer, the online conspiracy theorist who seems to be close to Donald Trump. Rick Scott was running as a protest candidate, and I think that he saw that one of those two Johns was going to get it, and he said, well, let's see what we can get for it. But now that Donald Trump and his whole team have gone all in for Rick Scott, this race has gotten much more interesting. I still don't think Rick Scott is going to get all the way there. I think most senators want to have a leader who is there for their own interests, not the president's interests. But as you said, this is a closed door secret ballot race. So you never really know. But I still think that they're not going to put their future in the hands of somebody like Rick Scott, who clearly will do anything that Donald Trump asks him to do.
Julie Sirkin and Brendan Buck, thank you both.
You know what time it is. Let's talk money, power, politics. And of course, let's talk about Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, an acronym that just so happens to spell Doge, a cryptocurrency linked to Musk, Dogecoin. It sure seems like that $130 million he spent to help Trump get reelected was worth every damn penny. Here to talk about it, Ron Insana, CNBC senior analyst and the CEO of iFi AI, and Cardiff Garcia, editorial director for the Economic Innovation Group and a former economics journalist at the Financial Times and NPR. Okay, so first of all, it's the Department of Government Efficiency, and they've got two guys running it,
Yes.
Vivek and Elon. That doesn't sound so efficient.
Well, we don't even know if it's not going to be an office of the government either. From what we've read thus far this evening, it's not going to be inside the government. And so that eliminates any concerns about them having to divest their personal holdings and any of the businesses they run. Dogecoin, by the way, just as an aside, is up 20% tonight on this news. Shocking that it makes absolutely no sense at all.
Just because they're going to say it's not going to be an official part of the government, both of these men have conflicts of interest or have investigations or have massive contracts with the U.S. government, and they will be in a position to cut programs, cut jobs, cut budgets, and at the very least, see where all the money is getting spent. So even if they're not officially inside the government, it feels like a conflict, no?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. But the question, too, is, I mean, they're talking, at least Elon Musk in recent weeks was talking about cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget. Now, of that, $900 billion or so is non-defense discretionary spending. Everything that the government can spend money on discretion in a discretionary fashion, but excludes interest on the debt, defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the things that are mandatory spending items that account for roughly 86% of the federal
interest
budget.
on our debt, one of the biggest
$1 trillion.
expenses we have in this country, and it's only going to grow.
Yeah. So you can default if you want, but that's a whole other set of problems if that's the way you want to get out of paying that particular
item. But isn't part of the key issue here, though, that we don't actually know if they're going to be in a position to do anything, right? In a position to cut anything? We don't know what kind of teeth this thing's going to actually have, right? We know that the White House has listened to these guys so far. Excuse me, Donald Trump has listened to these guys so far. But the Department of Government Efficiency isn't like an actual thing.
It could be Infrastructure Week number 11.
It could be. It could be nothing. By the way, the
could be a concept
nicest,
of a plan.
Yeah, the nicest, most charitable spin on something like this is that if it is paid attention to and if it is taken seriously, right? I'm not saying it will be, but if it is, it's not a terrible idea to have something like this that looks for inefficiencies in the government,
there are tons of people
right?
in this country that desperately want us to cut government spending, that want somebody on the outside to look at it because they feel like the government is so inefficient and fat. That's a fair gripe.
We did this from 2008 to 2010 with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which was an extraordinarily well done, well thought out attempt to right-size government spending, adjust entitlement programs, audit the defense budget, invest in infrastructure and education. This was put out in 2010 after the great financial crisis. Neither President Obama nor then Speaker Ryan accepted it, and so it died on the vine. You can dust it off right now, update it for current deficits and debts, and it would be still a very wise and thoughtful plan.
Yeah, right, Simpson Bowles was a sort of a nice idea at exactly the wrong time, back when unemployment was still pretty high, inflation was still very low. Now we kind of have the opposite situation.
All right,
so
well, then let's talk about inflation, because inflation, the cost of living, that's essentially what got us here, right? The election happened last week, and people in this country are frustrated, mad about the economic status quo. You analyzed voter data and found that places that shifted towards Trump the most were densely populated urban areas. What can you tell us?
The most densely populated and the most expensive urban areas. All right. It's one of the strongest correlations we found, and not just us. This data has been spliced by a lot of people at this point. And it seems like a few things could be going on, right? Here's where we kind of enter the realm of speculation a little bit. One is that people in these places are just super dissatisfied with what they're getting. A lot of those places are run by Democratic mayors, Democratic governors, and they're throwing out the incumbents just like the rest of the country did, right?
And the rest of the world, for that matter.
And the rest of the world, for that matter, right? And if you think about what happens in a place that's already very expensive, and then you look at the inflationary spike we had a couple of years ago, it means that the sticker shock you get in those places is even higher than in the rest of the country. Housing is a particular problem, and this is consistent with something else we've been seeing, which is that young families, families with young children, have been fleeing the biggest, most expensive places.
But that's also COVID.
But it's been happening since well beyond the peak era of COVID. In New York City by itself, the population of children under 5 is down almost 20%. And the people who've stayed behind, maybe because they can't leave, are registering their frustration at the ballot box.
By the same token, people have moved back to Manhattan, and rents are actually higher than they were prior to the pandemic for a wide variety of reasons. New York, Manhattan in particular, as it's got its own unique
characteristics. But not those young families.
Yeah, but not young families who have to put their kids through private school and find a place to live. But when we hear data like this and this analysis, right, for the last week we've been saying people could not afford to make ends meet. They couldn't afford their rent. They couldn't afford insurance. So they said enough is enough. But it's also much more affluent people who could afford it, but they're saying, I am not happy with this. It is not fair how I'm having to live.
Yeah, and this lived experience thing, it rankles me to the extent that as I travel around the country, I do not see an empty airplane. I do not see an empty restaurant. And it doesn't matter.
It doesn't mean that people aren't going to those places. It means they're pissed about how much they're having to spend there.
Well, yes, but they're still spending. That's the crazy part. So if you were really upset, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, as I did, and your parents were really struggling to make ends meet because inflation was 13%, unemployment was 11%, and you were waiting in gasoline lines in 1979 for 2.5 hours, that was a wildly different experience. Things aren't that bad.
Okay, I just met Ron, so I'm sorry to disagree with them already. One quick statistic.
None.
Median household income, is still lower than it was in 2019. Please.
The stock market has surged after Trump's election. That captured all of the headlines in the last week. But what we really need to keep an eye on is the bond market. I told you this on election night, and I really want you to pay attention, because right now the bond market is showing where trouble is, and it is really brewing. Yes, investors are excited about deregulation. They're excited about tax cuts. But those bond market traders see inflation ramping back up over the next 2 years. And soon, Donald Trump is going to need to pony up some serious answers about his economic policies, because all the ones we have seen so far seem incredibly inflationary. We're talking about a labor shortage from mass deportations, potential trade war over tariffs, and Donald Trump has given us zero specifics on how to handle it. I promise I'm coming back to you. Are we going to start paying attention to this? Because right now it's like deregulation, stock market's booming. What this is going to do to deficits, what this could do to the bond market, then it could be game over.
So here's where I want to just caution everybody not to overinterpret the moves we've seen in the last week. Here's why. It's true that everything Donald Trump is suggesting he's going to do is consistent with higher rates, right? Worries about more deficit spending, worries about inflationary policies. But at the same time, we don't usually associate a steepening yield curve with bad news necessarily. It really could be that there's some real growth expectations in there as well, possibly because of tax policies. If you're going to do something that's going to boost the deficit, it might also boost growth. So that is how I would sort of advise some caution on how we interpret these movements.
So my personal preference is to follow for predictions about the economic future, the bond market, far more closely than the stock market. It's once been famously said that the stock market predicted 11 of the last 5 recessions or things like that. The bond market's a very good predictor of future inflation and future troubles in the economy. So if we were to see rates go up considerably from here, I would start to worry about the very items you described.